All right, good evening. I think we can start with our event tonight, which is called Democracy, Nationalism, Populism, Trends in Austria and Hungary in light of European Union elections. It's nice to see that so many young people came, so it's going to be an intimate round, so please afterwards also feel free to pose questions to our excellent panelists whom I'm going to introduce right now. So we have here on my right side PÉTER KREKÓ. Welcome. He's a social psychologist, political scientist, and an expert on disinformation. He's also the director at Political Capital Institute in Budapest and a fellow at the University of Rijeka Center for Advanced Studies. Thank you very much for coming the way from Budapest. Yeah. Yeah, and we also have BERNHARD WEIDINGER, who hopped in on last minute. Thank you so much for this. Who is a right-wing extremism researcher at the Documentation Archive of the Austrian Resistance. Thank you so much for coming. And I do think we have a couple of interesting topics to address today. My name is FENKART. I'm the director here at the IIP, and we're going to talk in a dialogue format for the next, I don't know, I would say 30, 40 minutes. But then please feel free also to ask questions and to pose your questions or to address the speakers. Austria and Hungary, trends when it comes to the right wing, when it comes to nationalism. Péter, I would like to start with you. How would you say, why are they so successful in Hungary? Why are they so successful in Austria? Austria does have already quite a long time, long-term, I would say, tradition of right-wing parties. At the 90s, we had Jörg Haider, who was mostly the first right-wing populist, as we used to say at that time in Europe. And we remember that Austria was even sanctioned when they won the elections in the 90s. So nowadays, we are very, very far away from this. We do see that the FPÖ, the Freedom Party, is leading in the polls. We do have elections upcoming in Austria, but there are also elections upcoming in Hungary and European Union elections. Plus, Hungary is going to have the European Union presidency in the second half of this year. So please, can you just give us some sort of, what do you think, what is going on, what are the strategies, what are the trends in Hungary, and if possible, you can also kind of compare it to the Austrian case.
Yeah, so thanks a lot. I think this is thanks for the invitation and glad to discuss these topics. And happy to be back here at IIP. Also, we had previously some cooperation with BERNHARD as well. So glad that this that we can discuss it in this environment. So when it comes to the relationship between Hungary and Austria, I think they are both serving as models for each other to a certain extent. Orban, a few years ago, when he was asked, when he was still member of the European People's Party, he was asked that what kind of strategy Fidesz would like to have in the European Union, and he said that the strategy of Austria, and it was a time when the Freedom Party and ÖVP were in coalition in Austria. So it was the Kurz government time, and he told that if it's possible in Austria that the center right and the populist right cooperates, why wouldn't it be possible in the whole European Union? With EPP cooperating with, of course, ECR and ID as well. And I think that even if it has not really, his dreams have not been materialized then, and also Fidesz was expelled from the European People's Party since then. Right now, Fidesz is at the political land of nowhere in European politics. They are not members of any European political parties, which means that they have zero influence in the European Parliament practically. But they would like to gravitate towards the ECR. But right now it seems that if they will be a member of the ECR, and if it's, of course, up to many politicians to decide, Orban have indicated that he would be very happy to sit in the same group with Giorgia Meloni and the European and the Polish Law and Justice. Giorgia Meloni has been a bit less muted in her enthusiasm when she was asked about the idea. So I'm not entirely sure he can do that. But if he can, then I think in the next European parliamentary cycle, and we can already see that EPP and ECR will just cooperate more intensively. So it could mean also that Fidesz finds its way back to the European conservative mainstream a bit more. And I would expect that Orban will use the opportunity of the presidency of the European Union to, again, return back to the European mainstream a bit. So Orban is always highly critical of the European mainstream, but at the same time he wants to sit around the most important people, or most important tables with the most important people, and it has not changed. I would rather expect a muted, I would not say boring, but not very provocative presidency, so where Orban can prove that we can run the show well, we can organize it professionally, so we have a place in Europe. Austria served as a model for Orban to a certain period of time. Also, at the same time, we can just recall the Ibizagate discussion when Hans-Christian Strache told that he would like to see media empire similar to Orban, and I understand him totally, because Hungary has far the most centralized and most propagandistic media environment in the European Union. We can discuss it later, and also we can hear it from Herbert Kickl and others that Fidesz definitely serves as a role model for Austrian populists, and not just for Austrian, I think. So Orban is on power for 14 years within the European Union. So if you are looking around for successful illiberal politicians, he's definitely the one.
Thank you so much. Bernhard, what you just heard from Peter, I think it's quite interesting that Orban actually had Austria as a role model, and now it's kind of, I would say, vice versa, because we hear repeatedly Herbert Kickl, the leader of the Freedom Party, saying that he actually looks up to Orban and that he thinks he is a role model. How would you maybe analyze like the process of the Austrian far right, like from the 90s until now? What do you think? Why are they so successful in Austria? And they have been in power in Austria, but then you mentioned the Ibiza scandal, and we also know that then obviously the government broke apart. But interestingly, I think it was not only because of the Ibiza scandal, because the voters, most of them think that politicians are, I mean, those especially who have an affinity to vote for the Freedom Party, they think that politicians are corrupt anyway, but what they really actually were not happy with was the so-called Spesen affair, which also happened, and so which is kind of the enrichment, kind of an enrichment of specific political persons. So how would you analyze the situation in general in Austria when it comes to the far right and their success? Why are they so successful?
Well, in Austria, we have a situation where the Freedom Party has now been part of federal government 4 times, already 3 times since the turn of the millennium. And in those last 3 cases, especially in 2002 and 2019, they basically auto-destroyed. So they basically kicked themselves out of power. But it's interesting if you look at the analysis of that on the far right, because what the far right is saying is that what happened to the Freedom Party in these last couple stints in government is they were ultimately ousted because it is not enough to win elections. It is not enough to get into power. You have to be able to sustain power. And that's where Orban comes into play. Because as you know, there's been a lot of talk about Orbanization in Austria. For liberals, it's a nightmarish scenario in which Austria follows the path of Hungary, and it is a call to always be, aware that you can never take liberal democracy for granted. But for illiberals, it is a battle cry. It's what they want, right? And so what far-right strategists like Martin Sellner of the Identitarian movement are saying is that Orban has managed to sustain his power for so long because he also focused on the cultural sphere, the sphere of, the values, the narratives, the terms that are being used to describe certain social phenomena. And what they are saying is this is first important to even be able to win elections, but it's even more important in order to sustain your success. Because as long as the general climate, especially in the media, is hostile towards you, they will always be able to, cause you trouble, like with all the scandals and whatnot. So what they say is Orban has managed to not only win elections, but he has been able to really transform Hungary and transform the way people are thinking and feeling about Hungary, about the future, about what's important to them. Yeah, and that's where we're currently at. You'll probably remember that I think it was in 2017 where we had an actual debate going on between the People's Party and actual competition. Who was on better terms with Orban? Both Strache and Kurz never failed to mention how close they were with Orban. I don't see that right now because I think that the current leadership of the Conservatives is a little bit more not as enthusiastic about Orban as the earlier leadership was. But of course, whenever it comes to family values and security issues, migration, of course, Orban is being looked up at as a model for far-right parties all over Europe.
Can I just briefly reflect on that?
Please, sure.
I think it was very important what you said is the perception on Hungary that how Orban could change the cultural landscape, and Orban is very deliberately doing so. And I have to say a bit, sadly, that it seems that Orban is the one who best understood Antonio Gramsci's hegemony theory, which is about how to rule the concepts, how to rule the knowledge production institutions, how to rule the ideas, and how to use the institutions to push forward your agenda and ideology. And he wrote his thesis on how you can apply Antonio Gramsci's hegemony theory on the civic sector in Hungary, and he used it quite consciously from the very beginning of his political career from the 1990s. No other political parties have done it so successfully. So it's so ironic that an iconic figure of the left, an iconic philosopher of the left, is best understood by Orban in Hungary. And maybe it's not just Hungarian phenomenon. And I start to see that it's of course, I mean, the alt-right and the far-right that is in, they feel, and for good reason, that they are in opposition in terms of their worldview, but they seem to invest quite a lot into metapolitics, and they seem to invest quite a lot into knowledge production because they know how important it is. Why I think the liberal elites have become a bit more lazy in that respect. And yeah, so it absolutely fits into Orban's worldview, and also the wannabe philosophers around Orban, let's say so. They also like to quote Antonio Gramsci quite a lot, and his hegemony theory and quoting Hungary as well. And this is how the American conservatives look on Hungary as well. I mean, a country where these conservative values could finally return to the mainstream.
I think that's very interesting. I didn't know that about the thesis of Orban, but how can you maybe describe like how Orban himself developed? Because if you look at his at the beginning of his political career, he was quite in favor of, I would even say, liberalism in a sense, but then he became more and more Eurosceptical, anti-European, getting into these cultural things. Why do you think this happens? Is it, what is his ideology, and why do you think he transformed so much? Because if you listen to his earlier speeches, there are many things I would actually even feel appalled to. So, and now if you listen to him, it's quite the contrary. So why this radical shift in his programmatic approach? How do you assess the situation there?
A good question. If we describe it on the basis of political rationality, and we have a good reason to do so, looking at how successful Orban is, because of course there are the psychological explanations. I think that we don't really have to use the psychological explanations if we have very good political science explanations based on rationality. And so Orban first always based his politics on fighting with some kind of evil. And when he started his career, the evil was the communist regime and the communist ideology and socialist institutions. Then he what he realized quite early, and the first post-transition government in Hungary was a right-wing government that collapsed and failed quite miserably, as most of the post-transition governments in Hungary. High unemployment, high inflation. There was practically 0% unemployment before 1990, because it was unemployment within the walls. But it's like state sucked up all the workforce, not so efficiently, but it happened, and it was a huge shock therapy for most of the Central Eastern European countries. And when the right collapsed in Hungary, Orban just occupied this space, and it was quite interesting how liberalism gradually have become the other evil he was fighting with, and he developed to a stage where he is now, where it's mostly international liberalism and international institutions and the European Union that are the arch enemies of Hungary and the nation state. And there is one point of continuity in that, and this is that they say that they were always against internationalism, and they say as communism was international, right now the ideology of Brussels and this and the whole European Union is internationalism. It's homogenizing. It's something about killing the uniqueness of the nations, and so on and so on. So it has some coherence, but in most of the questions he made a U-turn. If you just listen back to his speeches, and you don't have to go back to 1990, but 14 years ago, what he told about Vladimir Putin and Russia is just the diametrical opposite of what he says these days. And why? Because he just feels the political opportunity. And finally, Orban is a highly successful political opportunist who sells himself as an ideologue. And everyone buys that in the international alt-right. And I think he can represent also the ideological component quite convincingly. But how can you, for example, be a very committed anti-communist with Xi Jinping on your right, and it's on your left, sorry, maybe, as it will happen tomorrow, because from Belgrade, the president of China will go to Hungary as well. They built up rather good relationships with Vietnam as well. There are increasingly good relationships with Cuba. So I think with the exception of North Korea, the Hungarian government had good working relationship with all the communist countries. And if you are, I think, principled anti-communist, maybe it could be a bit of a problem.
If you listen to that and when you compare it to the Austrian FPÖ and maybe also now Herbert Kickl, how would you place his ideology, and what do you think in this context of why is he so successful? I mean, we do know it's a very, very difficult time. I mean, we did have COVID, we did have obviously the huge migration influx in 15-16, which I think the right-wing parties have been very keen on using this moment also for their very anti-Muslim programmatic. I think we can quite rightfully say so. So what role does identity play for the Austrian far right in this sense, and how are they able to instrumentalize it? What would you say to this? I think
quite a bit of what Peter has just said applies to Austria as well. When we talk about the enemies of the Freedom Party, or the people and actors that they present as enemies, There's quite a big overlap. Of course, it's Brussels, the Eurocrats, but more generally, the West, really, NATO, the US. They want to cut down on US influence. You know, Europe should become more self-sustained. And that's also probably the key reason why the Freedom Party feels attracted to both Orban and Putin, because they share a lot of enemies. Also what they call cultural Marxism, which is a new term that they've been using so they can keep the anti-communist legacy going. But in general, I think geopolitical issues are not very important for the Freedom Party because they're not very important to the Freedom Party electorate. So what they care about is domestic issues and most importantly, migration. And what Kickl is saying, and this is also something that he likes about Orban and Putin, is that once he's in power, it will be Austria first and Austrians first. And the only relevant question in terms of how you position yourself in any matter of international affairs is what's the consequence for our country? And so if you talk about the sanctions on Russia, Kickl is saying, well, these sanctions, we are hurting ourselves with these sanctions, so we have to get rid of those. The Freedom Party under Kickl has toned down the pro-Kremlin rhetoric quite a bit, but they still call for an end to the sanctions periodically. And you know, right now they also call for an end to support for Ukraine. They say that this is not our war. In general, in international affairs, they are not, and I think this applies to the far right in general, they are not guided by universal principles, like human rights, but they are guided by the interest of the nation, what's in the interest of the nation. And just like Putin and just like Orban, this is the only thing that matters to the likes of Kickl.
I would like to ask, because you mentioned it also in your first remarks, obviously also of the role of media. I mean, the media landscape is very different in Hungary than it is in Austria, but we also witness in Austria there are increasingly attacks on media, let's say at least rhetorically, you know, like calling them Lügenpresse, don't letting them enter in their events, etc. But the situation is a lot worse, I would say, even in Hungary, because I think most of the media is directly controlled by Orban and Fidesz or people around him. So maybe you can give us just a little bit of an assessment about the media landscape in Hungary and how this is also reflecting then the political situation, or how it is supporting Orban in a way it shouldn't be, and what should the role of media maybe also be, actually, because we always call it as a watchdog of democracy. So this combination of media, democracy, and the role of Orban in all this.
Yeah, thanks. Brilliantly important question. I fall in love with the theory of Guriev and Treisman. It's Sergei Guriev and Daniel Treisman, two economists with some psychological instinct, and they invented a term which is informational autocracy or spin dictatorship, and their most important observation, and it's based on a global database, that autocrats today, especially the ones who are getting power these days, the last 2, maybe 3 decades, are mostly focusing on manipulating the information and less on direct violence. So there are less political executions in the world than it was before. There are less political imprisonments. Even, I mean, it sounds a bit of counterintuitive, of course, if you take a look at Russia and so on. They wrote the book before the Russian invasion, but I think it still stands. There are less, targeted executions of journalists, less crackdowns on protests and things like that all over the world, but more media concentration in the hand of the dictators. And if you own the media and if you can spin the information well, you don't have to use violence. So it's just easier, it's cheaper, And it's more democratic by the end of the day, isn't it? Because it's like people will genuinely believe your position. And this is what's happening mostly in Hungary. And I'm also saying that when we immediately label Hungary as illiberal and undemocratic, we have some reasons to do so, but what has to be told quite clearly is that yes, the elections have been unfair but free. All the last elections, according to OSCE observers who released very critical statements, for example, about the concentration of the media, but finally when people entered into the ballot to cast their ballot, they chose on their own practically. And this is how Fidesz could reproduce a two-thirds majority in the parliament with more than 50% of support of the votes in the last time, and it was fourth consecutive elections on which he could do that. And what was the most important tool for recreating their legitimacy? To occupy the media space. And I just cannot underline it enough how important the media is. How important, I would not say the free media, the pluralistic media is, the fragmented media. So embrace the fragmentation, even if it's sometimes can be, you know, as news consumers, it can be, you know, feel like confusing and so on. But if you have a media landscape that does not owned by a few people, and I think also if we take a look at the United States, for example, you can see the problems of the polarized media landscape as well. So it's like, of course, it's not unipolar, it's bipolar, but still polarized, and it can create a lot of problems. So the more fragmented the media system is, the better it is. There was a study that was done by some of my German-British colleagues who found that Hungary was the only country where, during the rule of right-wing populists, compared to Janez Janša in Slovenia, compared to Sebastian Kurz in Austria, could centralize the media system. But in Hungary, it was very spectacular. We arrived to a point where more than 500 media outlets in a country of 10 million are concentrated in one giga foundation that cannot be even questioned by the competition authority. It's about 80% of the media in terms of ownership. It's about 90%. They take 90% of the state advertisements. It's a huge conglomerate. It's politically driven. So the editors receive direct orders from the Prime Minister's office about what is the political line they have to follow, and they do it quite successfully. Or let's imagine a country where all the county newspapers, there are more than 20 county newspapers, have the same front page every day, and it's written in Budapest. So everywhere the same thing happens in the country, and this is written in Budapest. So it's really bizarre, and we are at a point. I mean, when you are, for example, attacked by the pro-governmental media, you can see that there is an article written on you, and it appears on several hundred media outlets, and you receive the media notifications like bullets from the machine gun, one every second, or even more, and it's really surreal. It has been quite successful, for example, in pushing this peace narrative that Bernhard has also talked about, that is the dominant narrative in Hungary, and it was dominant in the 2022 elections as well. And what is even more scary is that the government tries to dominate the social media landscape similarly and create an almost Orwellian social media environment. On the 2022 elections, in the year of the 2022 elections and the previous years, we could see that in Hungary there were about more than twice as much money spent on Facebook, on social media advertisement, than in Austria. Austria has a 3 times as big economy as Hungary. So, and the living standard is a bit higher. And who was the main advertiser? The state. And what was the advertisement? It's political propaganda and disinformation. Right now, more than 1 it's about 1.5 million euros have spent overall on Facebook and YouTube so far since the beginning of the year on political disinformation ads on Facebook and YouTube. And of course, for some reasons, these large online platforms does not see any problems in these players spreading disinformation from a huge amount of money. So the whole media system and the whole communication strategy of Fidesz is about quantity, it's not about quality. You push the same message everywhere from practically unlimited amount of public funds. And while it seemed to be quite successful in 2022, and just one indication, it's like about more than half of the Hungarian population thought when they went to the ballot boxes on the last parliamentary elections, then if they vote for the opposition, then everyday Hungarians like me will be recruited in the army and sent to Ukraine to fight directly, which was 100% fake. Still, majority of the voters believed so. So the propaganda was highly powerful. Right now, there was a clemency scandal in Hungary, a pedophile scandal, and right now there is a new emerging force, a political player in Hungary, a very unprecedented phenomenon. And right now, it seems that this spin dictatorships works much less efficiently than it before. So I would not say it's omnipotent, but if you own such huge part of the media, more than 80%, practically in one hand, I mean, it can be almost omnipotent.
Comparing this to the Austrian case, how would you assess the situation between the right wing and media, the public broadcasters? But obviously, I think this is also quite true for the right wing parties in Austria. They then call for this kind of alternative media. They actually create their own media, which are not that well known, but they at least they are for their audience. They can push their messages there. But then obviously also social media comes into play. So how would you assess the situation when it comes to media and the far right and the right wing in Austria?
Well, of course, the situation is quite different there. I mean, of course, the Austrian media landscape has its issues. I mean, we could talk about the huge amounts of money that governments pour into the yellow press. We could talk about the ownership structure of many of the big players that can have you question how independent they really are. But by and large, we still have a certain diversity. We also have public broadcasting that is, of course, fiercely attacked by the Freedom Party because they feel chronically misrepresented. But I think we can say that, by and large, these people at public broadcasting are operating according to journalistic standards. Now, what the Freedom Party has done is, and I would say they started that under Strache in the 2000s, 2005, 2010, around that time. They started to construct a sort of media parallel universe featuring both actual party media and party social media outlets like Hans-Christian Strache's Facebook page. But also like affiliated media close to the party, Telegram channels, streamers, influencers. And so they have created a situation where people generally attracted to Freedom Party talking points can consume a wide array of media every day and feel very well informed while having been fed only one narrative from all those media. And that is the narrative that the Freedom Party is pushing. And they have done this so successfully that they've now reached a point where they can say, we don't need those mainstream media anymore. Many people here will recall that, I think it was last year, when a private television broadcaster, Puls 4, had these summer talks where they invited all the party leaders, and Kickl said, "Well, this is a left wing, this is left wing media. I'm not going. I don't need to talk to you, and I don't need you to get my message out because our people know where they can get the info." And so the Freedom Party has become to a big extent actually independent from mainstream media. And of course they have announced that if they're in power, big things are going to happen in the public broadcasting sphere. We know that already in the last government, the last stint in government, they wanted to cut down very severely on spending for public broadcasting, make public broadcasting entirely dependent on the government by getting rid of by changing the model of financing. And we can be sure that if they come to government power again, they will do what they can to push through with that.
Maybe a follow-up question when it comes to media and democracy and the right wing. Would you say, and right-wing populism, would you say that the right-wing populism is always anti-democratic? Like, is it kind of inherently into their program or into how they actually think politics should be, how politics are done, or how political strategies are done? So the relationship between democracy and right wing, because they very, very often attack these, I would say, the basis of democratic foundations, which is obviously the basic freedoms, which is free media, which is human rights, etc.
Well, Kasmude, who's a very famous scholar of the far right, distinguishes between what he calls the extreme right and I think it's radical right.
Populist radical right.
Populist radical right. And the distinction is that the extreme right is anti-democratic, while the populist radical right is anti-liberal democracy. And so what is liberal democracy? It's based on the notion of equality, rule of law, civil liberties, human rights. And if that's what we mean by liberal democracy, we can certainly say that the populist right is clearly anti-liberal democracy. Of course, they themselves do not perceive themselves as anti-democratic at all. In their own perception, they are the real Democrats, and that's also the message that they keep pushing. You know, what Kickl is saying right now is, when I come to power, the people are going to be in power again. Yeah. You know, the people have been deprived of the power for so long. We are going to restore people's power.
Since Bernhard mentioned this word, which always I think is very interesting, is this illiberal democracy, because Orban actually says that Hungary is an illiberal democracy. And I don't really know if there is something existing like an illiberal democracy, because if you normally look at the constitutions, etc., it is actually a liberal democracy. So what is an illiberal democracy, and is an illiberal democracy still a democracy?
Yeah, I think unfortunately the constitution is not always describes perfectly a system. I mean, you can recall the Stalinist constitution, which, I mean, depicted a rather pluralist political regime, while in practice it was not exactly the same. So when there are huge political scientific debates about that. I belong to the camp that says that illiberal democracy as such is a non-existent thing, because of course, how Orban describes it is a bit similar to how you refer to Kickl's statement. It's like only the majoritarian element of democracy. So it's like the will of the majority. And until you have the will of majority, so until you're quite popular, you embrace this idea, of course, because it serves you. But it's a highly instrumental approach of even the majoritarian element of the democracy. While we could see when Fidesz was more in opposition, you know, they had some different understandings as well. They become a bit more elitistic about their understanding of democracy. It was, of course, a long time ago, because they thought that, you know, I mean, the masses are just easy to manipulate, and that's why the majority do not support us. So there is a slight contradiction even about the majoritarian element. But since Fidesz is the most popular party in Hungary for almost 20 years, no, sorry, about 18 years, yeah, 18 years, quite a lot of time. They embraced the idea of majoritarianism because they are the most popular. And in Hungary, in the electoral system, and of course it was changed as well, but if you're the most, relatively most popular party, then it's easy to turn it to absolute or even a constitutional majority. But they definitely do not embrace the idea of liberal institutions, which are the, let's say, guardians of the separation of power. And of course, when we talk about the separation of the legislative and executive power in many countries, it's a non-existent thing, and it's not only in dictatorships, but it not in all the cases the parliament is controlling the executive power and can and the parliament is responsible for them. But in many cases, the very centralized political machineries are selecting the members of the parliament in a way that they are just becoming, sorry to say so, button-pushing machines. They also don't really like the idea that the Constitutional Court can overrule some of the rulings of the parliament or the executive power. They don't, I mean, they are lashing out at courts when they are making decisions that they are disliked, calling them anti-democratic. What are these elitistic institutions? They just refer to these abstract legal ideas, why the will of the people is something different. So, yeah, they definitely very loudly argue for the majoritarian elements of power. But on the other hand, when Orban talks about his plans for 2035, and in the time scale, he does not even seem to really care with the possibility that he can lose the power before that. You can raise the question that how genuine this support for this idea of illiberal democracy. And in practice, for example, in Hungary, the referenda was made more difficult. I mean, the threshold was raised from 25 practically to 50%. And if you are really honestly majoritarian, you just give more voice to the people. And in practice, in illiberal regimes, this is very rarely what's happening. What's happening, though, is that you manipulate the public opinion and manufacture the public opinion. And in many, I mean, when Orban's regime is successful, they are not populists, they are not following the lines of the public opinion, they shape the public opinion. And this is what happened in the Russia issue. For example, majority of the Fidesz voters were harshly anti-Russian, and Orban turned them pro-Russian. So if you are successful in this informational sphere, you just don't have to swim with the tide. You don't have to follow the public opinion. You can just shape it to the direction you would like to.
Thank you. Since you mentioned Russia, if you look at foreign policy issues, I mean, the most important topics, obviously, for Europe these days is the war against Ukraine and Russia. But another one is very, very important, especially also today for the German-speaking countries, but also for Hungary in a different sense, is obviously also the war of Israel against Gaza. And what I think is super interesting is that the right wing in Austria, the right-wing party, actually manages to present itself very, very pro-Israel these days, considering if you look at the past of Holocaust, etc., and where they come from. I think it's very, very interesting how they manage it. So maybe you can reflect a little bit on the position. I mean, we do know that obviously Benjamin Netanyahu is a very right-wing leader there as well, and he also is quite authoritarian. So we also have, I would say, the notion that especially right-wing parties, they always present this personality, this authoritarian leader, and people are kind of looking up for it. They're kind of striving for this strong man, be it Trump, be it Putin, or be it Netanyahu. So maybe if you can reflect on the Austrian Freedom Party and how they approach the I would say the important issues which are going on, which is the war against Ukraine and Israel and Gaza. And maybe also another election, we didn't talk so much about it, is obviously in fall coming up. It's the US elections, where Orban quite openly states that he wants Trump to come back.
Yeah, well, as for Russia's war, I think I already stated before that while the Freedom Party is not as openly pro-Putin and pro-Kremlin as they used to be, they still very much present talking points that very much appeal to the Kremlin, calling for an end to the sanctions and so on. As for the war in Gaza, my short answer would be that obviously parties like the Freedom Party will jump at any occasion to frame Muslims as barbaric and evil and violent and terrorists, right? And this is what's happening now. And of course, as someone who studies far-right magazines that receive money from the Freedom Party, that receive guest commentaries, interviews from the Freedom Party, that are clearly anti-Semitic. As someone who reads that every day, when I read a press release like I did today, was put out by Maximilian Krauss, who's a Freedom Party, I think is he a Stadtrat? What? Some sort of position in Viennese local government, where he basically says, he's commenting on the camp that was set up yesterday at the University of Vienna, the pro-Gaza camp. And he says, this is a scandal, this cannot continue, we have to, protect our Jews. I mean, I can't take that seriously when I look at what the very same party is supporting simultaneously. So yeah, some European populist radical right parties, not the extreme right ones, because they have always been clearly not only anti-Semitic but also anti-Israel. But the populist radical right parties have performed a sort of a pro-Israeli turn, if you will, or at least some of them. But I think it's very obvious how instrumental that is, and that the rationale behind it is that they view this as a way to reshape their image, because they get accused of anti-Semitism a lot. They get accused of still harboring ambivalence towards Nazism, and so like the cheapest option that you have is side with Israel and point to that whenever you're being accused again.
And on Trump, on the election in the US, is there any position of the Freedom Party when it comes to US and Trump?
I mean, there was some sympathy for Trump. I remember Freedom Party officials traveling to the US. I remember one specifically who was very, very proud to snatch a selfie with himself and Trump. I think what they like about him and what they like about a scenario in which he wins the presidency again is that they expect the US to become more, centered around itself, care less about international affairs, become less invested in, especially in Europe, but in general, all over the world. And that is something that they like because they want to cut down on American influence. They've always wanted to cut down on that. I mean, I've mentioned the pro-Russian turn that they performed around, let's say, 2005. That's when it started, 2010. But that was actually new because, of course, for historical reasons, the far right in Austria was always very, very decidedly anti-Russian. So this was something new, but the anti-Americanism was always there and still is. But if I say anti-Americanism, I don't mean that they necessarily will be against any given U.S. president, because it's a cultural anti-Americanism. It rejects what the U.S. stand for. And an important reason for that is what you mentioned at the beginning. This idea that the whole world is becoming Americanized, it's becoming homogenized. We're losing our identity because of all the stuff that comes across the Atlantic. All those movies and all those trends that our youth emulate. So yeah, this anti-Americanism is clearly alive and well, whoever wins the elections this fall.
It's very interesting, and quite glad that you mentioned that FPÖ embraces the non-interventionist and more isolationist position of Trump. I think the same is true with Orban. It's not that out and open. He, of course, is quite supportive towards America as such, if it's conservative America. But on the other hand, this anti-Americanism that you talked about, which is rather a new product in Hungary, it has never really existed. Of course, it existed during the state socialist era, and you can find high levels of anti-Americanism among the pensioners, for example, because they were socialized in an environment where the United States was the head of the capitalist world, which was evil. But this new anti-Americanism of the Hungarian right is rather something. It's almost a greenfield investment, I would say. Not totally, because of course there are some historic wounds. For example, why United States did not intervene in 1956, why they let us fight the war against Soviet Union on our own. I think if United States would have intervened, maybe Hungary would be a radioactive ash now, but of course it's counterfactual, we just don't know. So there is some sentiment, but traditionally the Hungarian right was rather pro-US. And Orban was very highly pro-US as well. When he first met with Bill Clinton, it was one of his first, it was his first visit to the United States. He came home totally ecstatic, and it was a Democratic president. Right now, if he goes to the US, as he went last time, he went only to Mar-a-Lago and did not went to the White House. Not as if there would have been very high-level support for him, but still the bilateral relations on an all-time low since the transition. And what is Orban's narrative is that United States is the puppet master that is playing with European countries. All the sanctions are just because of the United States. All the anti-Russian, anti-Chinese stuff is just all because of the United States, because Europeans just cannot think on their own. They just became this child, and United States can manipulate them. And I think its assessment is wrong on so many levels, but they, I think, really feel it as a reality. And this is Orban's narrative: let's free Europe. Let's free Europe from US influence, which is also a Kremlin soundbite, but this is also something that is quite prevalent in the whole radical right in Europe. And that's where I think this isolationist stance of Trump is becoming quite sympathetic. So no one will tell Hungary that how undemocratic the system is if Trump comes back to president. There was some muted criticism even when Trump was on power, but I think in the second term Orban can hope for the right reason that he will receive less criticism from DC. But of course one question emerges. Hungary is a NATO country. If US withdraws more from the NATO and from Europe, as it happened, for example, from Germany in the first presidency, all the countries have to invest more into military. Is it in the interest of Europe? If there will be a protectionist president that will import much less German cars, parts of them were manufactured in Central Eastern Europe, including Hungary. Will it be good for Europe? Will it be good for Hungary? I'm very highly doubtful. If a highly anti-Chinese president will come to power, won't be there some systemic conflicts with the most pro-Chinese member of the European Union, which is Hungary? I'm doubtful about that as well. So there might be some hopes of this isolationism, but I'm not entirely sure that if Trump comes back to power, it will be this Disneyland for Orban as he hopes for.
Thank you so much. I do have one more question, since I mentioned it in the beginning, there are also European Union elections upcoming, and especially the hope for us, or for those who are more like in the liberal democratic camp, we always had the hope that, the national or quite nationalistic parties, that have a problem with cooperating with each other, because as you mentioned, they are looking at their domestic issues. They do not really want to cooperate with other governments, but how would you assess the situation right now when you look at the upcoming European Union elections, where we are going to expect a shift more towards the right? I mean, most probably not towards the right, extreme right, but definitely towards the right. And we also see, since you mentioned also EPP before, that many also conservative parties are drifting more towards toward right ideas, so right-wing ideas. So what does this mean then for the future of the European Union? I know it's difficult to say right now, since elections are still upcoming only in June, but I think it is important for us to see, especially in times of crisis where there is not one single solution. Austria alone will not manage the situation with migration. Austria alone will not manage the climate crisis, etc. So cooperation is needed. So how do you see this, like if we zoom out a little bit into the European context?
Well, I think the good news from a liberal perspective is that they actually do have problems cooperating. I remember over this last cycle, since the last European elections, there's been a lot of talk on the far right about the prospect of being able to form a unified faction of far right parties, basically a faction that would unify what's now the ECR and the IND, and that such a faction could become the biggest one in the European Parliament. And that was a hope that I think at this point we can safely say will not come to fruition, right? That's not going to happen. And one reason that's not going to happen is that this party family is quite divided on important issues. To mention just one, the Russia question. It's very difficult to find a consensus between far-right parties from the Baltic countries and Poland on one hand, and the likes of FPÖ and AfD and other parties that are very pro-Russian, pronounced it pro-Russian. And so also Giorgia Meloni is perceived as way too pro-European and too transatlantically oriented for many on the far right, including the far right in Austria. So there will be issues when it comes to faction building, but I think we can safely assume that overall the right-wing fringe in the European Parliament will most likely be strengthened.
Yeah, a very important question. I think we have to fight this old notion that, I mean, nationalists are totally unable to cooperate. And yeah, in the very long time ago, I just remember when there were some far-right groups in the European Parliament with, I think, Alessandra Mussolini, granddaughter of Mussolini, and I think the Great Romania Party, and there were some, I think, racist statements from the Italian side, and then this whole group broke up. So I think these days are over, because if we look around the world, I think that there is such a thing as this populist internationale, and some of them can cooperate better, some of them can cooperate well, but I think there is enough glue in the ideology, and especially I think the common denominator is mostly this pro-family agenda, which is, I mean, sometimes more openly, sometimes less openly homophobic. The anti-woke agenda, which is just becoming huge all over. Anti-immigration and this ethnocentric cultural criticism and things like that. So I think there is some glue, but there are also important division lines in the European Eurosceptic right, far right. I mean, if you listen to, for example, how the Giorgia Meloni or law and justice politicians talk about family issues, I think there is not that much difference from AfD politicians or FPÖ politicians. If they talk about Russia, there are a lot, and especially Ukraine, there are a lot of differences. And in a bizarre sense, yeah, I also don't believe in a huge unified group, but since the beginning of the invasion, the likelihood of that unified group just become lower, because one very important division line, and we can, Political Capital have analyzed it even in the polls, the most pro-Russian groups in the European Parliament are the left, the radical left, and ID, the radical right. And ECR is much more pro-Atlanticist, much more pro-Ukrainian. So it's a very important dividing line. We can also see it in the Italian coalition, how Lega and Brothers of Italy differ quite a lot in their position in Ukraine. And I think Putin ruined practically the idea of this whole united far-right group. And also there is one more element into that, and this one more element is that I think the main rule in the European Parliament is that everyone wants to gravitate towards the mainstream. So the more mainstream group you can sit into, the higher your influence is going to be. So anyone who can be ECR, I think, more reluctant to go to ID, for example, because they feel that ECR can be in coalition with the European People's Party, and yeah, it's already in formation. It will be, I think, even more present in the next term, and for that reason, yeah, there are the more radical elements in ID, AfD, for example, that openly talks about deportations and such other issues, not so always so openly, but it comes out in public. So and there will be always centrist radicals who want to differentiate them from these really radicals to be able to have coalition with the center. So I think even some of the radical parties would like to become just closer to the decision-making centers of the European Union, and it's just pure political interest.
If I may add just one more point to that, it was a peculiar case you mentioned in 2007. The faction was called Identity, Tradition, Sovereignty. Its main architect was one Andreas Mölzer. And I think they existed for only like 9 months until the rift happened between the Greater Romania Party and the Italians. But as you were saying, there is a big deal of glue, and I think they've always been successful and will be successful as long as they manage to concentrate on the commonalities. The most important of which I think are the common enemies, be it Brussels, be it foreigners, be it wokeism.
Exactly.
Thank you so much. We do still have time for questions, and yes, one in the back as well, and Marilla as well.
Rauchenberg Institute for the Danube region. I have questions concerning Hungary. The one thing is that after Orban got this 2/3 majority, he immediately started to get media, practically all media under his control. And the specific situation of Hungary is that you have few Hungarians outside Hungary, or media outside Hungary in Hungarian. So probably most of the population only are consuming news in Hungarian. Probably in some cities they're also looking for English news, English written news or whatever. I mean, Austrians could turn to Switzerland and Germany, but in Hungary it's just Hungary. So that's one thing. And the other thing is about anti-Americanism. It's absolutely strange because there should be anti-Russianism in history in any case. So I just wonder about the Soros case. I mean, it started more or less with Soros, if I remember well. And how do you see this situation? Because that's where he made him a devil, despite of the fact that Soros supported Hungary a lot. So if you could elaborate a little bit, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Very good question. I think, yes, this anti-Americanism, I think, have evolved gradually. And somehow, I think Orban, and I think it was more after he returned to power. I think he had some statements already back to 2008, 2009, but he had very good relationship with as today, the MAGA Republicans say, the Rhino conservatives, the old conservatives of the Republican Party, and also Orban was quite harshly pro-NATO even back to 2008, 2009, and these things usually go hand in hand. He called for immediate accession of Georgia and Ukraine to NATO after the Georgian invasion. So it was a lot of time passed since then, and he was also regarded to be a very hopeful new leader when he returned to power back to 2010 by many in the United States. So I think as he became more pro-Russian, and in that it was also a gradual move, but there was a big leap in 2014 when, before the elections, a highly intransparent contract was made with Rosatom on broadening the nuclear capacities in Hungary from Russian state loan and with Rosatom's activity. And of course, we don't know all the details of the contract. What we know, though, is that it was all more than 10 years ago. Nothing has been built since then, practically, out of this new reactor. But there has been quite a lot of money spent, for example, on preparation studies. Some of these preparation studies were conducted by companies that are in hands of very, very close friends of the Prime Minister. And so this is a very typical story, of course, money traps by Russia. And Orban was not the first politician who stepped into these money traps, but he was definitely one. And it's as he became more and more intertwined with Russian interests, he also elaborated. He received more criticism from the European Union and from the United States as well, and he increasingly developed this genuine anti-American sentiment. And of course, George Soros was something as a figurehead of the democratic, liberal, American left that is harshly against him. And it's very ironic because I talk to, people on the right, consultants of the government and so on, and they really genuinely seem to believe that George Soros is the puppet master of everything. George Soros has spent less money on Hungary in the last years than the campaigns against George Soros spent for the Hungarian government, and it's very ironic. So there was more anti-Soros money than pro-Soros money, but still this conspiracy theory holds, and I just sometimes fear that they really need this metaphysical evil, and George Soros is there to play this role. So he has his ideological function as well.
And on the Hungarian newspapers, I mean the language.
Yes, yeah, I think, yeah, you're right. It's like the solitude of Hungary, and it's an existing thing. I think it shapes political identity in Hungary as well. I mean, the political identity in Hungary is that we are alone, surrounded by enemies, and it's like, of course, not everyone is enemies, so I don't want to overstretch this logic, but we cannot really trust anyone, and language matters a lot in that, and I'm highly envious, I have to tell, to Slavic friends who go around in Central Eastern Europe and usually can talk to others in their languages. We can't if we don't speak any other language. What Orban tries to, how Orban tries to compensate with that is that he exports his ideology to Slovakia, to Romania, for example, to Slovenia, to a certain extent to Ukraine. So where there is a considerable Hungarian minority, they are pretty much, part of them are very efficiently brainwashed by the state media that reaches their word as well. And for example, Orban's media helped quite a lot to turn the Hungarian minority in Slovakia pro-Fico, and due to the state media that is broadcasted also in Slovakia, it was a considerable help. So he tries to exert influence in other countries through political consultancy, which is another thing, but also through Hungarian media broadcasting outside of Hungary. In Austria, it's not an issue because there is no big Hungarian minority in Austria, as far as I know.
didn't turn the back.
Hello. Thanks for the very interesting points you both made. I want to come back to Hungary again. There was a bit of a turmoil now, or there is a turmoil a bit in Hungarian politics. So we've seen a pedophilia scandal. The Justice Minister Judith Varga and Kathleen Novak, the president, had to step down recently because she pardoned a deputy director of an orphanage who was like involved in a pedophilia scandal. And yeah, we've seen protests. Media reports said there were hundreds of thousands of people in Budapest on the streets protesting against the government. There is a new political figure on the scene, PÉTER, who is having his own political movement. I've seen polls where he got more than 20% even, or around that. So I mean, he seems to get a lot of votes from opposition parties, but also from Fidesz. And Fidesz is not doing well in the polls for the first time since many years. I think they've dropped below 40%. So my question is, how could that happen? So first, were you surprised about the quite big movement that emerged through the TISA movement and Péter? Were you surprised by the escape of the media system, that some such aggressive or new movement could even emerge? And how do you see the prospects of the movement of TISA and maybe even a opposition movement win at the European Parliament elections, or in the future? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. You are pretty well informed in Hungarian politics, so it's like hard to add anything to your pretty good description. One slight correction, otherwise everything what you told was factually absolutely correct. It's like, according to polls that tend to believe more, Fidesz still has around 45% support among the active voters with party preferences. And on this basis, right now, FPÖ, as according to poll of polls, that's what it's an aggregate average of the pollsters, it's about 29%. So it's still a level up, and this new movement could bite way more of the current opposition's camp than the governmental camp. According to a poll, about 15% of the voters of this new camp is from our previous Fidesz voters, and the majority of them are previous opposition voters or new voters, because they people who didn't vote before because they were uninterested, and people who will be the first to vote because this guy has a huge impact on the youngsters as well, and a huge gravity. Was I surprised? Totally. Of course, all the political analysts usually say that I predicted that. No one predicted that. It's a black swan. You can't expect something like that happening, that a real insider of the regime is becoming a harsh critic of the government. Some question the genuinity of his criticism towards Fidesz when it comes to foreign policy issues. He is, to my taste, definitely far too understanding towards the peace rhetoric of the government, which is, in my view, is just the pro-Russian rhetoric. But it's not that far from the Hungarian mainstream's approach. So I kind of understand why he represents it as a politician. What is very remarkable about him is that everyone you talk to in Budapest about politics these days are just talking about him. But people who usually not interested about politics, among my friends as well, but you go on the streets, the taxi driver, the guys in the pub, everyone talks about him. What's about this guy, this Péter Magyar? And this is something, quite a new phenomenon in a country that have become rather disillusioned about politics, and everyone just got used to that nothing happens because Orban is in power forever. and right now he has more, about 25, 26% support. He can gain 4, 5, maybe 6, 7 votes as well in the European parliamentary election. He will definitely crash the current opposition. It's a question if he can crash the governmental side as well. The government is rather stable at the moment, but there is a big but here. And this is that if Péter Magyar organize a protest, hundreds of thousands turn up. Even in a country, in a city like Debrecen, which is a stronghold of Fidesz, tens of thousands of people turn up. It's huge. When Orban organizes rallies these days, a few thousand people turn up. So there's a big asymmetry, and Orban has always been the charismatic shaman of Hungarian politics, and right now he has a rather charismatic challenger, and this is totally something new. Do I know where it will develop? Absolutely not. I just wait and see, curious for the EP election results.
Thank you so much. That was a super interesting discussion, and I was making my notes all the time. So now I'm very much confused, but I will try to do my best. So I would like to ask maybe a very broad question. Since you're talking about the rights of the far right, which wasn't mainstream before, now it's mainstream. My question is, how did it happen, right? We have this idea that we're living in a liberal democracy that gives space to all political groupings to represent their ideas. So where were the faults of this liberal democratic system that brought this far right into the mainstream? And my suggestions, or maybe my thoughts that I was kind of picking up from your discussion, was it maybe globalization that, because like if we look at the issues that far right represents, it's LGBT, migration, what they criticize, right? And wokeism, media, free media is shut down, right? So is it globalization that somehow that they are reacting to, or does maybe the idea or how the liberal democracy was interpreted has some sort of a leftist leaning that is also not very welcome by some sorts of some part of the population that is not, somehow they don't feel represented, or that their ideas are somehow heard. Would you just disagree with that? And the question is then, because my feeling is that this current system is definitely somehow going through a major transformation, if not a crash. So what could be an alternative to the liberal democracy as we know it now? And what kind of alternatives do you expect in the coming future? And maybe a second question, but very shortly, on US internationalism, because you say that far right also, like runs as criticizes the US and cooperation with the US, but now increasingly also in light of the war in Ukraine and everything, the mainstream politicians also advocate for more, strategic autonomy or whatnot. So how can this narrative be, I don't know, made heard stronger, right? Because it's basically the same idea. No one is arguing with that we should decouple from the US a bit more. But
I do.
Yeah, what is in there? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Questions. I will leave it to Baron first.
Yeah, maybe I would just address this question on the reasons for the success of the far right. Really zooming in on the Austrian case, because that's the one I'm most familiar with, of course. And I think one thing we can say for sure is that the Freedom Party has a secure base of maybe 15% of the vote. That's something they can take to the bank. They will always have that. They have voters now that was different under Haider, but now they have like 15% of voters who have been voting for them their entire life or for a long time already, and who will not even consider voting for another party, who will maybe stay at home if they've become disappointed. But the Freedom Party is the only party for them. Most important reason the Freedom Party is successful, I maintain it is, whatever you want to call it, racism, nativism, ethnocentrism, xenophobia, whatever the name is, that's what fuels Freedom Party success since Haider. Now, of course, the pandemic has played an important role. In the Austrian case, because as you know, the Freedom Party did something that they always do. They occupied a sort of unique selling point proposition. I'm not a business admin guy, but you know what I mean. USP. So what they always do is present themselves as the only real opposition, as the only real alternative, when it comes to the sanctions on Russia, whether it comes to the EU, whether it comes to the pandemic, and of course, no, did I forget anything important? Sanctions, EU, no. Yeah, well, they have some forces fighting them on that field, I would say, but yeah, but by and large, this is the way they try to present themselves. I mean, Kickl keeps reiterating, he keeps talking about the Einheitspartei, like there was a unified party in Austria that all the other parties have subscribed to, and that I think appeals to people. And Kickl, the FPÖ, has been successful in convincing people that this is actually the way the political system in Austria is configured. You have the presumed unified party on one hand, who is pro-EU and anti-Russia, and pro-fighting the pandemic, and then you have the Freedom Party. So if you have a problem with any of that, Freedom Party is really your only choice. And that, I think, is also the reason why they were able to recover so quickly after the Ibiza scandal, and why actually they've always been able to recover rather quickly from crises that they created for themselves, because their electorate, or an important part of the electorate, will not even consider voting for another party. And as soon as they got back on track, and as soon as they get back to their opposition narratives, they will very quickly regain the strength that they had earlier. So I think that's what's been happening in Austria.
Yeah, thank you. Really good question. And yeah, I think if we are honest ourselves, people who regard themselves as somehow the fans of liberal democracies these days and international institutions and so on, sometimes it gets hard to understand because you have to step totally out of your perspective to understand what's behind the illiberal, anti-democratic and far-right ideas and why they are emerging. And of course, we are talking about a very broad phenomenon, and I don't believe in unique causality. So of course, there are multiple causes. I mean, one thing I would like to highlight, and I think it's the theory of Michael Minkenberg, if I'm not mistaken, that he defines the far right as this kind of revolt against modernity. And he says that modernity have changed our society so much in the last decades that we shouldn't be surprised that there is such phenomenon as far right. We should be surprised how small the support of it compared to how dramatic these changes have been. Composition of the ethnic composition of the Western societies, for example. I mean, in the last 4 or 5 decades, it was really huge. Change of the system of the economy. I usually do not like that much the structural explanation, but I think it has some impact here. I mean, when industry disappears in many countries, and also agriculture disappears, at least in the sense that not so many people were working in agriculture because everything is done by the machines. There is globalization, which changes the cultural habits big time as well, and also the social roles have changed a lot, gender roles, but also age roles, pretty much everything. So all the reference points you had in the past, religion is I would not say over, but it's in increasingly secular societies, it's just losing ground. So all the reference points, safe, secure reference points you had in the past are weakening, are trembling, and there is this embrace of let's go back a bit to the past. And Kasmude, I think, have a very good description. He says that far-right parties, populist right parties, are the parties of nostalgia. And that's quite interesting. They sometimes present themselves as the cool new voice, identitarians and so on, but their ideas are pretty obsolete, old, nothing new about that. You can repackage it, but it's like, let's bring back the past in certain segments. And I think we just, so that's I think probably the most important general driver. On the more superficial level, I totally understand, even if you take a look at what's on the top of the agenda of the in EU discussions these days, it's mostly immigration related topics, but also I think, Russia, it's also, and sanctions, it's also on the topic, peace, but also there is one other important element, and I think there is a new anti-green revolution going on in Europe. I would not say a motion. And it's like, you can already see it in the current European Parliament. And in the next European Parliament, the Greens will have much less support than previously, mostly because of Germany, but because of other countries as well. There is this emerging freedom narrative that the Greens want to tell you what to wear, what to eat, how to travel, what to do in your free time, how to use the tap water and things like that. They just want to control your life. Also, I think it's combined with this pervasive impact of the COVID lockdowns, where I think this freedom rhetoric again emerged, that the states and the scientists and the elites want to tell you what to do if you vaccinate yourself, if you stay at home and so on. And this freedom rhetoric of the far-right parties, I think it's very powerful. And it's about that, there are guys, there are the elites who want to tell you how to think, how to talk, how to behave, what to do, and we are the ones who want to liberate you.
US and strategic autonomy.
I mean, maybe I'm not the right person to talk about it. I was never a big fan of the idea of strategic autonomy, and for a very I'm rather, how to say, stubborn transatlanticist, for the very simple reason I think Europe at the moment cannot secure cannot defend itself military-wise. Of course, it can go steps to that direction, but why don't we think that the best thing to do for us Europeans to have strong enough big brothers who will defend us, and maybe the US is the best candidate for that. Right now, I mean, China is on the rise, and China is increasingly an aggressive revisionist superpower. Other revisionist superpowers are on the rise as well. I think Europe has no other option than we team up with the United States, and of course, it needs two sides. So, and certain segments of the US population and politics are not very enthusiastic also about building more transatlanticism. What I would work as a European decision maker at the moment to find good arguments for an upcoming Trump presidency, why to keep up supporting Europe and why to keep up building close ties to Europe. Let's build a big, there were many discussions about strengthening transatlantic ties, TTIP, trade, TTIP and others. I think some of these ideas can be brought back to mainstream, and I think some of Trump's statements, for example, about that EU exports more to the US than what the US exports to Europe. So there is some trade asymmetry. For example, let's try to fix it. And I think I can imagine that EU decision makers could come up with a good proposal that Trump could go back to US and say that I negotiated that and it's huge and it's something as a new trade plan that he could sell well to the public. So as I said, I just don't see any other alternatives. That transatlanticism, I think all the discussion on the European military, if I'm frank, I find them sometimes a bit ridiculous.
Please.
Just like to add one thing. I'm not a big picture guy, and I'm also not a foreign affairs guy, and so I'm very much a nerd with a very narrow vision on things, and so I can't really speak to these issues because that's above my pay grade, and I think most people here have more valid opinions on that than I have. But because Peter mentioned the nostalgia, something I remembered is that I actually remember both Strache and Kickl saying, not literally, but basically it's what they said, the Austria I want is the Austria I grew up in. So I want that Austria back. And they're talking about like 70s Austria, you know, when men were men and women were women, and the air was clean and the water was clean and the economy was humming. And most importantly, most of the people I met on the street looked like me and talked like me. Okay? So that's that's the vision, that's the utopia. Austria like it was back then, you know.
Thank you so much. I think we already come to the end of this super interesting discussion. I think we should do another one when we then try to dismantle like all these tactics, what we can actually do about it, like how can we at least slow down the rise and maybe even turn it around. So maybe we should do that again. Thank you so much for your time. It was very interesting. Thank you for coming, and if you still are interested in discussing a little bit, maybe you stay for a couple of more minutes. We serve a glass of wine or a glass of water or juice. So thank you for coming, and enjoy your evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation.